So I've been struggling with stillness, or more exactly the lack of it, for, well, a long time. There's no lack these days of books, articles, songs, reminding me that stillness is vital to my spirit and even to my physical health. But in the push and pull of everyday life, well, some days the closest I seem to come to stillness is playing music really loud, maybe in my earphones, while I'm in the kitchen doing dishes, and maintaining an attitude surly enough to deter any family member from interrupting me more than one time. And yet, I know that when I do not find ways to acknowledge and nourish the part of my being that craves occasional silence, I suffer, to say nothing of those around me who perhaps just wanted to help out by bringing a dish to the kitchen. And yet, when I decided to preach on this topic of stillness, my mind immediately went to one of my favorite old biblical verses. Be still and know that I am God. I am no longer sure that God is always the best way to name what I or others find in the still points of our lives, but I find this ancient commandment both compelling and reassuring nonetheless. It points us in the still center of our beings to a recognition of some reality that is bigger, older, and more stable than the realities of our individual lives. It's a challenging instruction, perhaps particularly in our own cultural setting, which values busyness and production while fearing emptiness and nothingness. This idea of stillness led me also to the story in the Hebrew Bible that centers in the translations of my youth on a still small voice that Elijah heard on the mountain. And I want to read that story from 1 Kings chapter 19 to you this morning. But first I want to give you a little background. In the biblical text right before what I'm going to read, here's what's going on. The Hebrew prophet Elijah has been very busy following instructions from the Lord. His archenemy, Ahab, the king of Israel, has married Jezebel, established her native worship of Baal in his kingdom, and, says the text, quote, done more to provoke the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than had all the kings of Israel who were before him. And if you know anything about the Hebrew Bible, those kings before Ahab did a lot of things to anger the Lord. Over a period of 3 years, Elijah has prophesied a drought, gone into hiding, performed a few miracles, and come out of hiding to have a dramatic public showdown with the priests of Baal, the conclusion of which brought the death of Baal's prophets at Elijah's hands and the end of the drought. Ahab, however, was not particularly grateful for the rain. And here starts the reading. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, so may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. Then he was afraid. He got up and fled for his life. He went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him, and said, get up and eat. Otherwise the journey will be too much for you. He got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, what are you doing here, Elijah? He answered, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away. He said, and this he is the word of the Lord, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way." So he set out from there. Thank you for your patience with that long reading, but I like that story. And when I came back to it with this lens of stillness, to look at it a few years ago, what I half remembered as a story about a still small voice turned out to be a little bit curious to me. First, there's a whole lot of movement, not stillness, in this story. And second, many of the newer English translations, such as the one I just read, do not contain that reference to stillness or the idea of a voice. What they say in the original Hebrew text, there's literally, after the wind, the earthquake, and the fire, a sound of thin silence, sheer silence in the translation I read. This prophet regularly gets verbal instructions from the God of Israel, and that God communicates with people regularly by way of signs involving fire and rain and the destruction of enemies. But the story points to this thin silence, this sheer silence, as the epicenter of an extraordinary encounter between the prophet and his God. Although ancient Greek-speaking translators added a comment, which was retained in the older English translations that most of us maybe remember from our youths or from hearing them here and there, most of those ancient Greek-speaking translators added a comment that God was in a still small voice and not in the preceding meteorological excitements. That assurance, like the idea of a voice at all, is not in the original Hebrew text, which raises but does not answer the question of what Elijah encountered in that silence. In typical Unitarian Universalist fashion, I'm not much interested in formulating a definitive answer to that question. But in reading the lines of dialogue that are on either side of this dramatic central point, I'm struck by a third unexpected and curious thing about this story. Nothing seems to change in Elijah's attitude as a result of this sheer silence. Before this silent epiphany, God asks, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah responds with a rather whiny, somewhat overstated litany of his troubles. Afterwards, God poses the same question and receives the exact same answer. It's word for word, the same answer. Nothing in Elijah's situation or in his evaluation of it has changed. And yet, immediately after this, the voice of the Lord issues a new set of instructions, and Elijah, who had before his pilgrimage into the desert lain down wanting to die, goes forth to continue his prophetic career and find his successor. Something about that experience of silence provided what Elijah needed to be able to continue his life. And I propose that sometimes so it is with us. Recognizing a need that we all share, I'm arguing, for experiences of silence or stillness leads me to three questions. How can we be still? What is it that we know in the experience of silence? And why bother? I'll clue you in at the start that I don't have answers to these questions. I'm certain both that the answers will be different for different people at different times, and the answers have varied for me at different points in my life. But here's my current thinking on the subject. In considering the how-to of being still, I have a three-part working description of what silence entails. First, stillness represents a cessation of all sorts of activity, physical, mental, and emotional. Secondly, for human beings, I think stillness requires solitude. We are such social beings that the presence of others almost always causes some movement in our souls or psyches. And third, stillness is best found in silence, preferably both within and without. Having laid out these requirements, I'm sorely tempted to throw up my hands in defeat. This is why I end up just listening to music and washing dishes, and feeling like that's the best I can do some days. Obviously, not many of us can manage to be completely still, silent, and alone for significant lengths of time. This is an ideal that I doubt can ever be achieved, let alone sustained. We rarely have control over the noises in our environment, and sometimes we aren't able to limit the intrusions of others into our space and time. And even if we could control external factors, we have, in fact, far less control over our own selves than we often wish to acknowledge. I don't know about you, but I find it almost impossible to stop thinking. Although I have become pretty good at reading about the idea of observing one's thoughts instead of being controlled by them, although I have to note that it's sort of the same as how I'm really good at reading about planning menus or building a deck on the back of my house without actually doing those things. At times, I find it painfully distracting to sit still physically. And though I've been well coached in control of my emotions, life teaches me that that goal is probably impossible and often unhelpful. However, overwhelming evidence from cultures and religious traditions around the world points to a basic human need for stillness, as well as to the possibility of seeking it in the midst of our busy lives. Classic spiritual texts and popular media provide us with a menu of innumerable techniques for achieving stillness, for entering silence, for connecting with the center of one's being. You're probably familiar with many of them already, but it's fun anyway to make a list. Meditation, for one, which could, of course, generate its own list of how-to options. Prayer, pilgrimage, reading or study, worship, repetitive movements of all sorts, walking, running, swimming, dancing, needlework, all come to mind for me. Breathing with attention, yoga, projects combining focused physical movement with just enough mental engagement to eliminate or drown out a certain amount of chatter in our heads. Maybe cooking, manual labor, I don't know, maybe Zumba. And then the creation and appreciation of art of all sorts. All of these are things on my list. You might have more. You probably do, and I hope later you'll share some of your list with me. Many, many people find the experience of being outside conducive to stillness and silence. Hiking, boating, spider watching, and fishing, for example, can be recommended as activities that might open onto an experience of stillness, even though they involve a certain amount of movement and can also be practiced in ways that lead to busyness instead of stillness. And although I've identified solitude as a crucial component of stillness, both observation and personal experience tell me that sometimes it's much easier to coax ourselves into stillness in company than alone. One of the first things that I loved about being Unitarian Universalist, for example, was the ability of congregations, previously unknown in my Sunday morning worship experience, to sit together in silence, the way we did just a few minutes ago. On the one hand, it seems to me that any of these activities in this very long list I had might be undertaken as spiritual disciplines, and might, if undertaken with regular practice and focused attention, provide opportunities for moments of silence and nourishing stillness. And yet, clinging to the testimony of seekers before us and considering the list of potentially stillness-inducing activities, it seems to me that in finding your own stillness and still point, besides a willingness to experiment, the trick may be to hold that impossible ideal of stillness in mind while ignoring a cultural tendency to seek perfection and instead pursuing balance. So if your life is heavy on physical movement, sitting still might be in order. If you sit at a desk all day, movement might be best, although you may need to discern whether you should climb a mountain, swim laps, participate in a countywide relay, or stretch in a yoga class. Or Zumba. Zumba's good too. The practice that works to bring you to a place of stillness may be counterproductive for me. I find I am pretty constantly exploring what works for me, and you'll have to figure out yourself what is best for you. What sort of stillness deficit do you have in your life? Perhaps you might experiment with ways to detach from your thoughts, or gain distance from your emotions, or rest your body, and see what new things you learn. And so we come to the question of what is found in stillness. The short answer in biblical terms is often God, but other traditions apply other names. Oneness, true self, in capital letters, in contrast to the small socially constructed self. The web, which connects everything that exists and which we find in our seventh principle. Emptiness, the center of both the individual being and of all that exists. Tao, peace, being, not doing. Compassion, interbeing, nirvana. Most traditions insist that the reality being named here is in fact beyond the power of language to describe. Pinning it down in language is futile. We are liable to find the results of our efforts seem like dry, dead leaves in contrast to the green vibrancy of our peak moments of experience. My personal favorite statement of this principle comes from the Tao Te Ching, which begins with the words, Tao called Tao is not Tao. But every religious tradition I know reminds us that some truths are very, very difficult to express clearly, and perhaps impossible to communicate secondhand in any complete form. Whether differences in naming these experiences point to differences in what is really experienced, to differences in linguistics and culture, or even to individual differences in temperament and intellect, might be interesting questions to explore, but I'm going to stick with my original 3 questions, and I'm move on to the third question, the so what question. And when I do that, I'm struck by the impossibility of predicting what any individual person will take away from an experience of stillness. That takeaway seems to vary from person to person and moment to moment. The experience of stillness may always be, as the wisdom traditions of the world suggest, a return to a true self or a remembering of a foundational reality or truth that underlies our everyday lives. But the impact of that experience and the expression of that understanding vary widely. And I found recently does anybody know the name Richard Rohr? He's a Franciscan monk, and he has a center out in Arizona in the desert somewhere that focuses on contemplation and social action and where the two intersect, which I find really interesting. And he's also he's a lovely writer. He comes from the Christian tradition, but kind of pushes the envelope a good bit. And I found an interview that somebody from the Black Lives Matter movement was doing with him. And there was a paragraph I want to share with you at one of his answers. He was asked this question: how can the contemplative tradition and meditation serve as tools to help people overcome white privilege? And he says, some form of contemplative practice is the only way, apart from great love and great suffering, to rewire people's minds and hearts. It is the only form of prayer that dips into the unconscious and changes people at deep levels, where all of the wounds, angers, and recognitions lie hidden. Prayer that is too verbal, too social, too external, too heady, never changes people at the level where they really need to change. Only some form of prayer of quiet changes people for good and for others in any long-term way. It sustains and deepens the short-term wisdom we learn in great love and great suffering. Forgive me for making that an absolute statement, but I believe it from years of working with people. What I find interesting in that is it's a statement of what my intuitive sense of the importance of stillness has been, whether you take that experience and apply it to the Black Lives Matter movement or to any other social problem or movement or ideal. This idea that it takes whatever your experience in the world is, the love, the suffering you encounter, it takes stepping back and being still with it to consolidate change. I find that interesting. Very, and yeah, I hesitate to make absolute statements too, but I know he's been at this game a whole lot longer than I have, and so I'm inclined to listen to that insight. So, coming back to this, that the takeaway from stillness changes and varies from person to person and time to time. What I suspect does not vary, the reason we need to attend to stillness and to cultivate it in our lives is that it will affect the rest of our lives and the world around us. Stillness is not about our doings, but neither is it antithetical to them. It is the center of the wheel around which the spokes and the rim roll through the world. It's the empty space within that makes the pot useful. Because our world is full of noise, our lives are full of questions and problems which engage us but are not truly our own. To be still in most times and places is countercultural. It gives us perspective on the cultural conditioning that can make our lives more convenient, to be sure, but also makes our lives less free. As we become more aware in silence and stillness of how things really are, of who we really are, then we have choices available that were not available before. When we are able to make choices with integrity, that is, choices that flow from the truth of who we are, however we understand that, instead of choices founded on the fearful stories we tell ourselves when we lose our sense of connection to the web of existence, the benefit accrues not only to us as individuals, but also to the whole. When we move authentically in the world, we are bound to be more effective, and our efforts are more sustainable. With a little stillness at the center, we can face our lives and the company of other beings who surround us with equanimity and compassion. As the Tao Te Ching puts it, in words which might seem to you either blunt or elegant, Tao endures, your body dies, there is no danger. Although it's not usually expressed quite so baldly, many wisdom traditions include some variation of the admonition, be not afraid. Like Elijah, who really is in a difficult and dangerous spot, we need from time to time to enter into stillness and be reminded that we can touch and rely upon a bigger reality than that of our own limited existence, so that we can find the courage to take the next small step that lies in front of us. In closing, I want to share with you a little writing from Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Buddhist meditation teacher, leader. And I know you're familiar with him because I saw his name somewhere out on your bookshelves. Our true home is in the present moment. To live in the present moment is a miracle. The miracle is not to walk on water. The miracle is to walk on the green earth in the present moment, to appreciate the peace and beauty that are available now. Peace is all around us, in the world and in nature, and within us, in our bodies and our spirits. Once we learn to touch this peace, we will be healed and transformed. It is not a matter of faith, it is a matter of practice. As our service this morning draws a little bit closer to its close, my hope is that our practice, individually and collectively, our practice and practices of appreciation and transformation continue as, like Elijah, we go forth and return on our ways. Blessed be, and amen.